Hi.
Hi, I'm Amy with Climate Nexus. I think we're still waiting on a couple of participants to join. Uh, Thank you so much for getting online already.
Thank
No
you.
problem.
Hi, Miriam.
Hey, sorry, I'm just logging in.
No,
Left a meeting late.
thank you so much. We're really glad that you could join us today. I think we're just waiting on Adriana from Voces Verdes, and then we can go ahead and get started.
Okay. I do have a 1:30 stop.
Absolutely. I think we should only go for half an hour, but thank you so much for making the time for us.
No problem.
All right, I just followed up with Adriana, but I think since everyone else is here, we can go ahead and get started. We wanted to host this Google Hangout today to talk about how climate change is a women's issue, seeing as International Women's Day was held earlier this week. Um, and climate change, while it affects everyone, is not always automatically connected as a women's issue. So today we have some awesome expert panelists to talk about not only how climate change affects women, but how women are working to combat climate change and are being part of the solution. So just wanted to welcome everybody. I'm going to give a brief intro of who all is on right now, and then I'll throw to the panelists for your responses to the questions. So we have Bridget Burns of the Women's Environment and Development Organization, where she is the Advocacy and Communications Director, working to implement the organization's advocacy goal and influence policy. We have Reverend Dr. Miriam Burnett of Resources and Promotion Health Alliance, who's both a practicing doctor of internal medicine and an elder in the African Methodist Church. And then we also have Abby Mackey, who is the grants manager of Solar Sister, which is a company that works to eradicate energy poverty and empower women in Sub-Saharan Africa. So with that, again, thank you so much for joining us. But I was hoping that, first of all, you all could talk about, in your work, how you've seen climate change have a specific impact on women.
Do you have a specific order to go in?
Sorry?
Do you have a specific order that you would like us to address?
No,
Okay.
anyone can take the floor. If you'd like to go ahead, Miriam.
Sure. I see a couple of things. First, one of the most important things that we see is that women and children are always the most affected by any adverse situation. And when you talk about climate change, you talk about water access to potable water. You talk about ability to bring in food supplies, sustainability of food. You talk about income in general. And one of the things that is always interesting to me is when we talk about women, you also talk about, I think the number is 70% of women potentially fall in the world, potentially fall below the poverty line. And those who are poor are automatically more affected by, again, any of these adverse situations. One of the things that I'm seeing is that women are becoming very, not becoming, are very strategic in how we are dealing with those adversities, finding ingenious ways to farm and identify water, whether it be through wells or the like. But what also is what I'm finding interesting is those that are able are also looking at ways of identifying ways to help climate change. I was talking to one of my colleagues who runs who is now the troop leader of a Girl Scout troop, and she went to the school and asked whether or not instead of bottled water, the individual bottled waters, whether they could go to a system of a clean, obviously, water station, with then having all of the children having reusable water bottles, and it was not only accepted by the school, but the school then recommended that the Girl Scout troop make that same presentation to the school board. So what they was only going to affect one school has the potential to affect many, because it's now going to the entire school district. So those kinds of things are important and being done.
Thanks, Miriam. This is Bridget here. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Yeah, I think that the premise of what Miriam was presenting is really the way we do our organization approaches all of these issues. Obviously, we're the Women's Environment and Development Organization, so in our history, it's always been about trying to help, other movements see the linkages between all of these issues, see the linkages between women's rights issues as well as environmental degradation. And essentially, climate change is really threatening to exacerbate the inequalities that already exist worldwide. So inequalities that we see in terms of women's access to and capacity to own and continue to build in their own communities to all kinds of natural resources, whether it's wood, fuel, or water resources. All of these are being impacted by climate change. And so the policies that are being designed to combat climate change, as well as the impacts that are being felt, have differential ways of being experienced by women and men. And there are examples really from around the world in how that happens in communities and spaces. And I think one of the things that's really important is it's not necessarily, although a lot of the rhetoric around the links between women and climate change will focus on women in developing countries, which is certainly true. And there are a lot of particular realities in many different countries. But from Bangladesh to New Orleans, the injustice of climate change is really felt by those with the least access to resources, who are often women. And I think that that's always really the starting point for helping people to understand this nexus is in showing the inequalities that exist based on race, class, and gender, and how climate change is impacting them. And then, of course, it's talking about the role that women are playing in their communities, and a lot of what Miriam was alluding to as well, in terms of coming up with sustainable solutions that actually really reflect the needs of individuals as well as the communities that they live in, that they work in, and how these kinds of bottom-up solutions are really sustainable in terms of combating climate change. And just what we need to think about when we are, now that we're in a moment where we have this Paris global agreement to combat climate change, and essentially governments around the world are agreeing that we need to keep warming well below 1.5 degrees, but the pathway to getting there is not clear. And we need to be working with other women's groups who are already they're already innovating solutions. I think that Adriana can speak probably from her experience into and just working on solar cook stoves and through Solar Sisters, for example, of some of those solutions that are happening. So how do we make sure that these solutions that have been women-led, that have thought about the role that people are playing in communities, how do we ensure that kind of just transition? And one other fact, just if we look at the kind of revolution that we'll need, particularly in terms of energy, in the next few years, or that we've needed for a long time. And, in the U.S. alone, although we have over 50% of graduates in the U.S. are women, the women still make up only 20% of the energy sector in many cases. And so there's a lot to think about from a gender lens, both in terms of who's impacted and who is in the position right now to really lead on the kinds of solutions needed to combat climate change.
Thanks, Bridget, and thank you, Miriam. I just want to welcome Adriana to the call and introduce her for everyone who's tuned in. Adriana is the Director of Partner Engagement of NRDC and the founder and executive director of Voces Verdes, which is a national coalition of Latino business, health, community leaders, and organizations who are all working on action for climate change. So Adriana, our first question is, how does climate change impact women specifically? And I think Abby from Solar Sister was going to go next, but we'd also love to hear your thoughts.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me. And I'll chime in as soon as Abby talks a little bit about her work. Such a great issue. So I hope everyone's following us and tweeting about this online. Thanks for hosting this. I can, of course, respond to the question if you'd prefer, but I think that you're right that having women in the energy sector is one of the key things, especially when we're talking about transitioning. If we have a situation where we continue to perpetuate these old models that the only women that are really in energy are at lower levels or in administrative positions, then we're not going to see that same sensitivity towards what's really at stake. If you look at most households, whether it's here or in the developing world, women are really making the majority of the decisions on energy use because it's one of the key household decisions. So it makes a lot of sense for us to have some leadership role in how energy is used and how clean energy is developed, and in really elevating the importance of that and tying it back to the impacts of climate change. Because again, when we're talking about the impacts of climate change, of course, the issue is how is this going, for most women, how is this going to affect my family first? But even for women who don't have families, there's still, for most adult women, there is still a certain responsibility for siblings, for elderly parents, for others. And that's something that's undeniably in our psyche as women, that we keep that as a priority. So we're feeling the impacts, even here in the developed world, on both of those fronts, in our energy decision making and in thinking about how climate change is going to impact us. So for me, the important thing is that we look a little bit further back and empower women and girls to own these issues. One of the things that we hear a lot about, of course, is the importance of having girls be more involved in science, technology, engineering, and math careers. And I don't want to sound like a broken record on that, but it's so important because the truth is that energy careers are critical, and we need women who are prepared for those. So the more that we can bring girls in early on, showing them that there is a space for them here, that they have the capability to be involved, that they can be entrepreneurs, that they can be owners of companies. And luckily we have an enormous amount of women who are now entering the space who will be able to lead the way and show our younger daughters and sisters and others that women do belong in energy careers and can make a tremendous amount of difference simply because of that sensitivity. I think what we often overlook, even ourselves as women, but truly as humans, we bring our experience to whatever we do. And as women, we bring that unique experience of having that additional concern for family, but also having that additional worry that if we were to be in a dire climate situation, or if things continue to proceed the way they are, we're going to be more impacted, we're going to have greater responsibilities, and we're going to be facing greater risks as women. That, I think, will inform our thinking and help to develop better solutions.
Awesome. And I think we have transitioned naturally to talking about how climate change impacts women to talking about how women are being part of the solution, both in small ways, as Miriam mentioned with the Girl Scout story, but also in larger ways and taking a larger role in the energy sector. And I know, Abby, at Solar Sister, that's something definitely that you all work on, not only for women but for development as well. And I wanted to see if you could talk more about what you all do and how you all are working with women in low-income communities in Sub-Saharan Africa to really make that happen. I think you're on mute. Nope. Oh, I'm sorry.
While we're trying to
Yeah, Miriam, go ahead.
I'm going to say, while we're trying to get her volume back on, one of the things that another example would be in many of the areas at the AME Church is scattered across the world, we're starting to use solar energy in order to provide energy resources for communities. So the tops of sanctuaries and churches are being slowly transformed into resources that provides electrical energy for the entire surrounding community. We're seeing that also with wind in places like Malawi. And so the little things that one small financially situation where a church has a lot of money can be actually turned into something that can actually supply resources for an entire community just by the use of solar panels.
Yeah, there is tremendous potential for solar. And Abby, I think we've got your audio back.
Yeah, I'm sorry about that. I'm not sure what was going on, but I hit a button and it started working. So I can add on here a bit on the work that Solar Sister does. And I think we very much function on the tenet that women should not be viewed just as victims of climate change, but as active participants in the process. And when it comes to talking about the impacts of climate change, I think it's so critical to address the fact that though women around the world are feeling its impacts, women who are living in developing nations are feeling those impacts disproportionately and more, and they lack an ability to adapt to those impacts because of their household income, because of the resources that are available to them. So when it comes to climate change, our women entrepreneurs are on the front lines of that, and we are creating economic opportunity for them to, first of all, increase their savings. Most of our women who work with us cite one of their #1 benefits of being a Solar Sister entrepreneur is that I have extra savings for a rainy day. And when it comes to climate change, you have no idea what's coming next in your household, and you don't know how far you're going to have to travel for your next bundle of wood to cook with your clean cook stove. And so that extra savings, which I don't think is talked about as much, is that economic opportunity is so critical to climate change, because it's just not about what are we feeling at this moment, how are we being impacted, but can I adapt to those impacts? And women who are traveling 800 hours a year to gather firewood, that number is increasing exponentially as forests are being plowed over and I think that that's such a critical component that Solar Sister works on, is that economic opportunity, and then clean energy, which is of course critical to the conversation. And it can't just be large policies that do this. It has to be action on the ground, and putting that solar energy product in the hands of someone who's living in the last mile, who's living in rural regions, who won't have access if someone isn't in their community selling that product. And I think that though long-term policies and long-term solutions are so important, there is a need for action right now at this moment, and there is a need for small solutions that can create bigger changes. So it isn't always a huge solar installation, and it isn't always a large project. It's sometimes just getting that solar light to that family so they're no longer using coal and they're no longer using kerosene. And so I think that's really, really important when it comes to Solar Sister.
And I just wanted to also build off of what Abby just said, because I think, you know, part of the work that we do is really intervening into global policy spaces to bring this information into, you know, for the last several years, we've been engaging in the UN climate negotiations to make sure that we have language around women's rights and gender so that people understand these interlinkages when they're developing policies. But really to the point that Abby was just talking about, and since a lot of what we've been talking about here is that really that justice sort of energy nexus, and sort of how we need to combat that as we transition and as is necessary. And one of the things that was really noticeable to us is that internationally there was a huge shift in a focus towards what are the solutions, and that's really important. But what we were seeing is that often we would bring forward amongst, and I say we, I mean we do as part of this women and gender constituency and a larger group of organizations that have been working to intervene into the policy processes. And we weren't seeing the types of solutions that we would necessarily put forward being really highlighted. It was really sort of more large-scale, top-down, big solutions. As you said, the large solar investments, large wind, which of course are part of our overall solutions, but we felt like it was really important to that we can't just focus on scale. It has to also be about things that can be replicated, and sometimes it's not about things being very large in nature, but about best practice being replicated in many different countries and communities. I think that's a really important piece, and it's part of a larger narrative that for us is really linked to the Women in Climate Nexus, which is around promoting energy democracy. And in this transition, we feel like a sustainable solution will be about not just sort of changing the hegemonies of power over energy from fossil fuel to renewable, but really challenging the power structures of how we have access to energy. Really, for us, that's about, you know, having choice in our households and our communities about where we get our energy from. And a lot of this is really around focusing and harnessing the solutions that are being done at the local level, which need to have investment, which need to have attention from the international community, and which potentially need to be replicated in many different communities and countries. We have this publication that we have been, I'll send everyone the link, that we've been working on, which is a collection of these gender just solutions, as we were calling them, that are being done at the local level, that are women-led, that for us we think need to inform this international narrative around the solutions to climate change. And it's very, very much linked to all of the things that have been presented here, I think.
I think one of the other things that is often not talked about is how climate change affects health in general, but then specifically around vector-borne concerns. We're watching a rise in malaria. That's been documented as being related to climate change. But then my question becomes, as a physician, and I don't have any documentation to this, but things in my mind start to go up if we've got other vector-borne infectious diseases that are on the rise. For instance, let's just look at Zika. What is that? How is that related to climate change? What are the things that we need to be looking at and instructing? Yes, we're instructing women and men on ways to avoid vector-borne diseases, but what are we doing in order, Lyme disease, what are we doing in order to affect a change at the vector level? And so, yes, we are talking about climate change, but how are we talking about, I don't think we're doing a good enough job of talking about the health-related effects of climate change, not just the economic and how do we, and water, but these other things that are related to infectious diseases that are on the rise just makes me raise my eyebrow and say, what are we doing about this?
Yeah, that's right. I just wanted to jump in. I think especially in developing countries that's true, but even here in the U.S., I mean, we're not immune to any of these vector-borne diseases, and I think that Zika is the perfect example that mosquitoes, as we know, can carry all types of diseases, and we know that this type of weather, that climate continues to perpetuate and worsen, whether it's storms or extreme heat, and generally the combination of both are the prime just breeding grounds, create prime breeding grounds for these types of vector-borne diseases. But in addition to that, when you talk about health, it's not just vector-borne disease. You're talking about asthma. You're talking about any type of respiratory disease, pretty much, that gets worse with worsening air quality. And the issue with that, as far as women, as I see it, is, and you'll see that I'm a mom, so I'm kind of coming to this from a mother's perspective. But when I think of having to care for your children, take time off, not only is it hard to think that you've got to sit in an emergency room with your poor child who's suffering, or your grandmother or grandfather or parent who's suffering, but you're having to take days off school. And so for women with limited incomes, days off of school for your child and days off of work for yourself. So if you have a limited income, you're in really dire straits, because it's just compounding and compounding. I focus a lot of my work on Latinas, and one of the things that was really impressive is that the Hispanic Leadership Agenda prioritized climate change, and one of the key points that they made was how this affects Latinas on this front, because of, as mothers, having to take time off from work, having to care for your children. In addition to that, of course, heat in the fields, which I'm sure that you all have seen in the developing world, also plays a tremendous amount and has a very serious impact on how people can make ends meet and how they can truly survive. So I think that more than for men, it quickly becomes a more urgent issue for women.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I think you bring up an important point about messaging. And so when we talk about health, we do need to talk about the types of messages that work not just at a policymaker level and the government level, but for women. And how do we get them to care about climate change? And it's not always protect the environment, plant a tree. It is largely health, that women do respond to those types of messages when you bring in the health of their household and their family, and the type of messaging that works when you're trying to adopt a clean cook stoves. Women and men perceive the benefits of clean cooking and solar energy products and clean energy in general completely differently. And so it's understanding the type of messaging when you're working with women that will work. It's not just climate change is important, but this is how you're being impacted by climate change. This is how your community is being impacted by climate change. And really having a strategy for that is important.
I think that's a really great point. Sorry, I was just going to say, I think that's a really great point about the way that we talk to women about why they should care about climate change, and how we can further expand that message and reach more people to make this a top concern and make solutions a top priority. And I know that we're running up on the half hour now, so I wanted to see if anyone had any last final words about, what we can do to spread that message further to more women and get them into the movement and really invested in what we're doing and by acting on climate change.
My final plug is going to be that last year prior to Paris, a number of women's groups around the world initiated what's called the Women's Global Call for Climate Justice. And if you look up womenclimatejustice.org, you'll see that campaign. And we are ramping this up again to really focus on how to really get more women engaged in the climate change activities and movements and actions. We'll be having a big month of actions in May. And so I just would invite people who are interested to join that, to get engaged in that space. And there's lots of other resources for other groups that exist that are making these connections and how they can get more engaged.
Thanks, Bridget. Miriam?
One of the other things, in addition to health, I think we need to target concerns about housing, especially in our coastal regions. And people tend to think about coastal regions being the Gulf Coast in the United States, but look what happened with Hurricane Sandy. Look at what's happening on the west coast of the United States. Look at what's happening in our islands, where less and less land is available on the islands. Look at the coastal areas of every continent. As the water table rises, the land obviously diminishes. And so we need to be, it's one of the other ways that we can approach engaging women is our housing is becoming more and more of a problem. And how do especially women who have less economic impact or less economic ability just up and move. And so we need to be addressing climate change from not only the economic, but also looking at health and housing, because they're all very tied together.
Yeah, and I'll go off of what Miriam said. I think that's choice piece is so critically important. Do you have the ability to move if your community has a scarcity of resources? Do you have the ability to change the type of energy you're using? That choice is so important, and that environmental justice piece is critical. And typically we see that large lack of choice with women and with women who are living in developing nations. So that's where I think Solar Sister plays a critical role, and other organizations who focus on women's enterprise and these economic opportunities to promote climate change solutions come in, and they do such great work in creating that choice for a woman, putting an extra income in her hands so she can make changes and adapt to the impacts of climate change.
I think that's true, and this is just such a great discussion that I think could go on for hours, and it should. And what we should do is just continue to talk about this to all of our friends and to our younger friends, especially to our daughters and women who are in school, and providing those opportunities, those examples. I mean, we have such examples of leadership by women in the environmental movement, and we have leaders around the world, and sadly many, like Berta Cáceres, who was just murdered for her activism. But we have women who are leading on all of these issues, on climate, on energy. We need to just foster that as a path for women and talk about this as a natural place for women to be. And I think the sooner that we do that, the better, the more that girls are going to feel like this is their responsibility as well. And that will humanize it. That'll, again, take it out of this being just something that is about engineering, and bring it into the space where this is truly about what is at stake, which is our humanity, our existence, and the quality of our lives. So the more that we can talk about this, the way that Miriam said about our health, about our housing, and the way that Solar Sister is doing it about our opportunities, I think that that's really when we're going to start to see women get more engaged here in the United States. I'm really excited to be part of this and to be part of this women's justice movement. I look forward to activities in May, and hopefully we can all continue to engage more and more women, not just in this month, but moving forward. We have such leadership potential. We need to just exercise it.
Absolutely, and I want to thank all four of the amazing women who for joining us today and having this important conversation. I think, again, climate change isn't always thought of or immediately connected as a women's issue, but it so clearly affects women in such a specific way. And women are certainly taking leadership roles now, and there is even more room in, you know, the growing solutions where women can take a role for themselves and for their families and for the next generation. So I want to thank everyone again for joining this conversation. It doesn't stop here. I'm going to share the YouTube video, and we look forward to all the other activities that we have that you all have planned. So again, from myself and Climate Nexus, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.